Thank you very much for joining, everyone. My name is Jamie Stewart. I'm the Deputy Director for the Centre for Energy Policy. I'm going to be hosting the webinar today, which is in fact the Centre's celebration of our 5th birthday as well. So thanks again for joining. A few housekeeping notes. We're going to have a number of speakers to begin with. While people are speaking, we'd ask that you keep your cameras switched off and your microphones on mute. We will have opening remarks from Brian Wilson, and then an address from the Centre's Director, Professor Karen Turner. Karen's address should last around 20 minutes, leaving us about 20 minutes after that for Q&A. Now, if you would like to ask a question, and we would encourage you to do so, please feel free to type the question into the chat box when either Brian or Karen are speaking. We'll then, as a team, have a look through the different questions that are being proposed, and during the Q&A, we will invite you to actually ask that question if you feel comfortable to do so yourself. So if you're invited to ask your question, please turn your microphone on and feel free to ask that question or make a point yourself. As I said, the Q&A will last for about 20 minutes, and we'll try and finish up that session by 4 o'clock. We'll then encourage people to stay on for a virtual networking session, which again, we hope lots of people can join for, where if you feel comfortable, we would ask that you turn your camera on and turn your microphone on, and we'll have an open discussion, and that will be loosely chaired. Another point to note before we get started is just to make people aware that we are actually recording the session, and that will be available online afterwards as well. I want to take a quick opportunity to thank our advisory group for all of their input. They do a great job in advising the work of the Centre. And I'd also like to take this opportunity to quickly thank some of our key funders. So I'd like to thank the Bologna Foundation, the Children's Investment Fund, EPSRC, Climate Exchange, and SPEN. So now I'd like to get started. I'm going to hand over to Brian Wilson, who's going to give some opening remarks. Now, Brian is a great friend of the Centre. He's currently the chair of the Centre for Energy Policy's advisory group. Brian is a former UK Energy Minister and continues to serve as a Privy Councillor and UK Business Ambassador. Brian's a journalist by trade. He spent almost 18 years as a Labour MP for Cunningham North and held 5 ministerial posts. Since leaving politics in 2005, he's written extensively on energy issues and continues to do so to this day. You'll probably often see articles that Brian has written in the UK papers. Brian and his family live on the Isle of Lewis. He was in fact just showing us the view, made us very jealous. And he's currently the director of a number of different organisations, and he's currently the chairman of the Harris Tweed Hebrides. But most importantly, in my view, he's currently a visiting professor with the Centre here. So Brian, I'll pass over to you to make some opening remarks.
Jamie, thanks very much, and it's a pleasure to speak to you. As you say, I'm in the southwest of the Isle of Lewis in the Outer Hebrides, so if we'd more time and more technology, I could go out the door and show you some of the finest wave power potential in Europe, but we don't. It's a real pleasure to do this and to mark the 5th anniversary of the Centre. I just say first that I've only recently taken over as chair of the advisory group, and I just pay tribute to my predecessor, Ian Marchant, who did an awful lot to steer the work of the Centre in its formative years. As you probably know, that the original concept of this gathering was not just to mark the 5th anniversary of the Centre, but also in the run-up to COP26, which was going to be held in Glasgow, and hopefully will be at some time. And the idea was that this session would be a focal point for trying to shape an agenda for COP26. Sadly, COP26 has given way to COVID-19, and we're in a very different scenario at present. But it's a very big but that far from making this gathering and the discussion we're having less relevant, it's made it even more relevant than it otherwise would have been, because as we emerge from the public health crisis that we're in just now and the economic wreckage which is going to be all around us very soon, then energy policy and the part that energy can play in the economic revival is going to be beyond measure. And the more thought goes into that at this stage, the more planning goes into it at this stage, then the better the outcomes are going to be. And I think that one of the strengths of the centre has been in these 5 years to make a very strong linkage between the theory of energy policy and its impact on the real world and the outcomes that can be achieved. And really that's what we're going to need in the years ahead, the months ahead even, is that we don't need talk. There will be plenty of talk. We need actions, we need investment, we need to know where we're going, we need to know how that investment can produce the best results in creating employment, in creating economic activity, and also critically in contributing to the carbon reduction emissions which are at the centre of every government's policy at the present time. And there is a unique opportunity here. I know it's a cliche to talk about turning a crisis into opportunity, but it's exceptionally true in these circumstances, because we do need to find ways out of the economic consequences of the pandemic, and energy is uniquely placed to do that, and not only to produce economic benefits, but also to contribute to the other great imperative of our age, which is the tackling of climate change and the achievement of zero carbon emissions within the timescales that have been set. So it's a really exciting time for energy policy and should be seized as an opportunity. And from everything I've seen of the centre and the work it's done, it's extremely well placed to make a contribution to that. So we have to think positively in the months ahead. We have to think about how we break down barriers that might normally stand in the way of creative thinking and decision making that will actually make a difference. And we have to use every tool at our disposal to make sure that there can be investment on the scale required and in the directions required in order to make a real difference and at the same time deliver on our carbon reduction ambitions. So that really is all I want to say, just to set that scene that it's a problematic time. It's changed the nature of this meeting. It's changed the nature of the wider economic scenario in which we're operating, but it's made it more relevant rather than less, more urgent rather than less, and more exciting rather than less, because we really are in a position now to make policy or to recommend policy which can be adopted. But if any sensible government is going to be looking for ideas at the present time, they're going to be looking at the kind of research that the centre does so well, and therefore our position is critical, and we should make the most of that opportunity to make a really positive contribution. I just want to say before I hand back to Jamie, just to pay a great tribute to Karen and her very small team but very effective team. That the drive and energy that Karen has brought to the post is quite exceptional. She has been absolutely critical to turning it into a respected force within a relatively short space of time, and a go-to place for opinion and for wisdom on energy issues. So I look forward to hearing from Karen. I look forward to the discussion that will follow, and I thank everyone. I believe we have folk from Bologna here to be very welcome, from the Hebrides, and also from Spain, and probably, I hope, for others around the world that they'll announce themselves too, and certainly all over the United Kingdom. So it's a great online gathering. It's a great subject to be talking about, and I hand you back to Jamie now to conduct the rest of proceedings. Thanks very much. Thank you, Jamie.
Thank you, Brian, for those warm words. And I'd like to take this opportunity as well to thank you for all your time that you put into the centre as well, and that's very much appreciated. So we're now going to move on to our presentation from Professor Karen Turner. So I'm sure Karen's face is familiar to most of you joining today's webinar, but for those of you who don't know, Karen is the Director for the Centre for Energy Policy at the University of Strathclyde. Karen has previously held academic posts at a number of different Scottish universities, where she was in the economics department at Heriot-Watt, at Stirling, and also at Strathclyde University. Her main research interests lie in considering and modelling the economy-wide and macroeconomic impacts of energy policy and industry developments, and she's going to talk about more about that today. Karen is currently a Commissioner on the Just Transition Commission, which is set up by the Scottish Government and I think is world leading in its approach. She's also was a committee member on the Royal Society of Edinburgh's inquiry into Scotland's energy future. She was also recently on the Cost and Benefits Advisory Group to the CCC, ahead of their net zero advice, which again I think has been a bit of advice that's led to some world-leading legislation from both Scottish and UK governments. So Karen, I'll hand over to you. You're going to run through your presentation, which should take about 20 minutes. And as I said, if you have questions that you'd like to raise or points that you would like to raise as Karen's speaking, please enter them into the chat and we'll make sure that we get to them after Karen's finished. Karen, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Jamie, and thank you very much for the warm words, Brian. And welcome everyone to the webinar. We're really delighted to have you here. You know, as we've been talking about, you're probably aware that we had planned to hold this event in early May at the campus in Strathclyde, where we planned to have some drinks and nibbles and maybe even a birthday cake. So I'm sorry we can't offer that to you today, but it's fantastic. We can still have so many of you joining online, and perhaps that this has brought in more of an international and even UK audience than we would normally have. So the centre's 5 years old, and I really can't quite believe that, but it's been a fantastic 5 years, and that's largely down to the staff we've attracted to the centre. You might hear from some of them during the Q&A, and also from the strong collaboration and support we've had with colleagues, both from our university and others, from industry and from government and other bodies involved in energy and climate policy research. So I'd personally like to take this opportunity to thank all those people who we've worked with over the years. For those who've just joined today and who might not know us at the centre, and we hope we do have a fair number here, I want to just start by giving you a quick overview of who we are. We're a multidisciplinary hub. We're based within the School of Government and Public Policy at the University of Strathclyde. We're a small but growing team of social scientists, engineers and knowledge exchange staff, working to facilitate research and, importantly, policy stakeholder engagement on climate and energy policy issues, but set in a wider public policy context. I would say the whole team are not in the photo on your slide. Updating that is going to be a job for when lockdown ends. I think where our real strength lies is in the fact that our approach differs from the perspective of focusing on technological solutions and how to drive them through. Instead, we focus on the wider economic, social and political context and consequences of different decisions and actions. And understanding and considering how these consequences may be affected by different types of intervention is really the key to unlocking a range of energy and climate policy solutions. And this perspective is really critical in considering the political and social need for a just transition to net zero. And the last point on the slide, which we'll return to shortly, is that, importantly, our core research expertise lies in investigating the wider economy impacts of different actions and engaging with a wide range of policy stakeholders to understand the implications and how these might be affected. This enables us then to provide crucial insight on who ultimately pays for different actions, including but not limited to energy bill impacts, where and how benefits might accrue, including in what sectors and regions. Understanding the nature and magnitude of how different benefits materialise and could be affected by policy is crucial in understanding how they could play a role in offsetting some of the costs that we may face in the near and medium term in getting on the path to net zero. So from this particular perspective that we take in what we do at CEP, one of our plans for the initial birthday event, as Brian's been saying, is that we planned to present and invite open discussion on 5 key messages that the Centre was developing for COP in Glasgow. Now, while we've had a few months of uncertainty, it is really great to see that we now have new dates secured for the COP in November 2021. And we're obviously very excited to see that the plan seems to still be to hold it in Glasgow. And what is discussed at, and perhaps more importantly in the lead up to the COP, is now inevitably closely linked to what policy and economic decision makers are challenged with in considering the post-COVID world. So on the slide here, I have the 5 key messages that we would like to present for discussion. And these are 5 key messages which I will run through very quickly now. These are set in the context of what we think needs to happen to ensure a just transition. And they've also become more important, even more important now, given the current economic environment related to the COVID-19 pandemic. So our 5 messages focus on the importance of, first, how understanding who really pays, how and when and what games can be used to balance this is fundamental. Second, how in terms of the political feasibility and societal acceptance of actions, we need to find transition pathways that allow us to sustain and to grow our prosperity in an equitable way. Finding options and pathways that can deliver near-term returns is crucial, and this is now especially so in a post-coronavirus pandemic economic environment. The fourth point is that offshoring of industrial or other emissions-intensive activity is really not the answer if it only shifts emissions, jobs and GDP overseas. And finally, net zero is really a societal and public policy challenge more than it is a technological one. And I want to reiterate that final point because I think it's particularly important when considering the just transition that the Scottish Government is already committed to, but also that's something that all governments must address if actions are to become politically, socially and economically feasible and sustainable. And I think the current crisis again reiterates this point, that getting to net zero from a political perspective is not about advancing new technologies, it's really about finding a path that's going to be economically feasible, socially feasible, and particularly in the latter point, well, both points, politically acceptable. And by prosperity, I really mean we need to think about the livelihoods and lives of real people. So while we need to consider the prosperity of future generations and the climate in that context, and let's face it, school children have been so effective in telling politicians that, we also need to consider how we sustain jobs, career paths and livelihoods while we transition to a society and economy which by 2050 is going to look very different. And this is also what makes ensuring prosperity for people so important for policymakers and for bodies like the UK Treasury, who know that jobs and economic activity more generally, that's not only important and good for local regions and people's livelihoods, no, it's also incredibly important for the public budget and crucially may help us to pay for some of the net zero actions that come at a price tag. And considering these types of issues and questions and how dialogue and solutions around which consensus can build will develop, this is something that has been a key focus of the research and work at the Centre for over the last few years. Here I'm showing you some examples of our policy briefing publications where you can see we apply our type of analysis to different technological solutions like carbon capture and storage, electric vehicles, energy storage, but crucially where we've always set out our investigations in terms of what these solutions offer to the economic and societal transition that directly impacts people's lives. Now there's a number of examples from our work that I could present for you today, but I'm going to focus on 3 examples in policy areas where decarbonisation is seen to be particularly challenging, being in private transport, the energy efficiency of our homes, and the currently emissions intensive but high value industrial processes like chemicals and cement. I'll focus in a wee bit more detail on your insights from our latest round of work, investigating how electricity network investment to enable the EV rollout is likely to impact key indicators of economic well-being, for example, GDP, earnings and employment throughout the transition timeframe. Supporting the uptake and transition to EVs is seen to be one of the key solutions in reducing emissions from private transport. However, the requirement to charge vehicles is going to place a significant strain on the electricity network, and this is something that the distribution network operators are significantly concerned about. Now, at our centre, we're not looking at how to upgrade the network, we're concerned about the implications. And one issue is that network upgrades carry a significant cost, one which, under current regulatory arrangements, will be paid for by all consumers over an albeit lengthy time period, generally the average 45-year lifetime of new assets created. And for this reason, the regulator is quite rightly keen to ensure that we don't build in paper capacity that we don't need. Just how consumers respond to smart charging capability impacts both the level and timing of investments, which in turn will impact the cost recovered through bills and how jobs in the economy are ultimately impacted, both by the investment activity and by actually enabling the rollout of EVs. And this latter factor is key. A recurring finding in our EV research is that shifting our spending from using petrol and diesel to fuel our transport needs towards using electricity could have sustained positive impacts across the economy because of the potential for increased reliance on domestic supply chains to generate, transmit and supply electricity in the UK. So we wanted to understand firstly what the likely nature and potential magnitude of investment in electricity network upgrades to support the EV rollout would be under different broad scenarios regarding consumer responses to smart charging capability and over what timescales it would be needed. Our work in this regard was informed by use of the Times Energy System model. It showed us that from a very high level perspective, the investment needed could potentially be between 10 billion and 17 billion for the GB electricity system, about 1/3 of which would be spent in the UK. And this is when we shift now to economy-wide modelling to look at the impact of that investment and the rollout. The variation in the timing of the investment and thus the wider economy impacts of both cost recovery and economic stimulus is determined by how quickly consumers uptake smart or off-peak charging. The quicker they do this, the total near-term and overall investment requirement can be markedly reduced. So on this chart that I'm showing you on the slide, we show our research results in terms of the modelled economy-wide impacts of making and paying for the potential levels and time paths of investment, and also from shifting fueling from fossil fuels to electricity as we uptake EVs. And we're looking at the impacts in 3 key indicators of economic well-being. And what you can see here is that all 3 scenarios show a net positive and sustained upward trajectory on GDP, on employment numbers and the associated wage earnings. Moreover, if you note that GDP and earnings both increase at a higher and faster rate than employment, means that the quality of employment is measured by average wages at least, and if GDP is measured by labour productivity, they can also be expected to increase. And this is particularly as we increase our dependence on the type of domestic supply chains supported by the UK electricity industry and other things that household consumption might shift in favour of. However, you can see that the adjustment pathway is impacted by the level and time path of investment and cost recovery. And we see the biggest lag where high levels of upfront investment are required and where the consumer response to smart charging capacity is slow. While this in principle provides a greater economic stimulus, having more upfront investment, it does mean that the cost recovery and thus the effects on energy bills, these impact earlier. And considering this type of investment path is important, even if we can be more optimistic about people's response to EV charging in other contexts, such as what might be implied by our nearer term renewable heat targets in Scotland, where significant upfront investment upgrades may be required, what we're seeing in this type of scenario would probably recur. So what are some of the key insights that we can draw from this work? Well, let me draw out 2 key issues here. First, aside from the specifics of how energy bills are impacted under these scenarios, it is important to understand that any action that involves more domestic spending, which we can expect to see a lot of in the COVID-19 recovery stimulus, both the investment itself and any positive impacts from enabling or realising things like the EV rollout, and how that impacts UK households spend their money. If you have more domestic spending, you put upward pressure on all prices. And this includes costs faced by all sectors of the economy, for example, including labour costs, and that could have important impacts in the competitiveness of export-intensive sectors like manufacturing. So we have to be very careful what we do in price pressures when we're trying to stimulate or invest to get on a net zero pathway. The second issue relates to the particular nature of the impacts on the price of electricity in the case we've examined here. I should say that in all the scenarios we modelled, both the increased demand for electricity as we roll out EVs and the need to repay the network investment costs for bills, these both combine to put upward pressure on the price of electricity. We know that this acts as a constraint on growth and again will contribute to driving up the consumer price index and the costs faced by high value sectors like manufacturing and also obviously on the spending power available to households. And of course that the electricity prices driven up for all consumers could drive up income inequalities and penalise those who are already in fuel poverty and struggling to pay bills. It's also likely that these households would be less likely to benefit from the wider economy gains we've described, and that's because they just don't earn as much from the wage and capital incomes that get a sustained boost when the economy expands. So, as we've highlighted in one of our key messages for COP, we think that policymakers have a key challenge in ensuring we get onto a net zero sustained prosperity path in an equitable way. And this may be particularly important when a number of policy objectives and actions may interact and compound impacts. For example, if consumers also have to pay for upgrading the electricity network to facilitate the electrification of heat, well, we have to think about the most effective and fair way of funding this. But we also need to consider how energy price changes may impact the success of other policy actions, such as those supporting residential energy efficiency. And this is another area where we've done work and continue to do a great deal of work, increasingly involving collaboration with government officials and access to real data and programmes such as Energy Efficient Scotland and the Energy Company Obligation Eco. Again, our focus is on the economy-wide impacts of these residential energy efficiency programmes. And again, energy efficiency is seen as a key component of getting to net zero, where it has the ability to reduce heat demand and therefore emissions. But it also allows households to save money, which will allow them to improve the quality of their lives and health. And from a wider economy perspective, it allows them to free up more disposable income to spend in other sectors of the economy. So depending on just how programmes are designed and just how local, regional and national supply chain capacity can respond and evolve, what we would call the enabling stage of retrofitting could also provide an important source of stimulus, even if that's only transitory. Though transitory could mean a number of years in the context of long-term programmes under EES and ECO. On the other hand, our findings demonstrate that there is a trade-off in relation to targeting particularly public resources towards households who are in fuel poverty. While we know that they will benefit most individually from more energy efficient homes, we know that the wider economy impacts will be constrained because even when made significantly more energy efficient, low-income households simply don't have the type of spending power that will trigger a big economy-wide expansion. So again, policymakers have to balance questions of social policy against pursuing individual, local, regional and national economy benefits when considering how to deliver a just transition. One final example of our work that I want to flag, but I won't go into detail, as many of you may have already heard me talking about it in last month's All Energy plenary, is industrial decarbonisation. And this is one of perhaps the most problematic challenges for the continued prosperity of our economy and our ability to deliver a just transition. It's also the area where many of the challenges we must consider are becoming very stark and very real in the current COVID-19 context. We just can't simply offshore production to reduce our emissions. While this has been a source of substantial environmental wins in the past, that just won't work either for global emissions or for our own economic well-being. So the challenge is, how can we decarbonise in a way that ensures the continued prosperity of people, businesses and public finances? And here the key issue is that there are some hard and complex challenges to be addressed. We have to accept that some elements of the net zero transition will have a net cost, and we need to be careful in considering just who these costs should fall on, particularly now when the UK is taking a lead on net zero and thus asking firms operating here to potentially move ahead of their international competitors. The wider economy and international marketplace response could ultimately punish those most vulnerable through the transition process. And that will hurt all of us, because if we lose activity and jobs, we lose tax revenue, public services and the ability to pay for this whole thing. So we come back to the point that we need to investigate and understand the economic, societal and thus the political consequences of different courses of action, and how policy intervention can be targeted to ensure that these consequences can be effected to deliver the type of just transition that so many of us have begun to talk about. So, in this current state that we're living in, do we have a new understanding of the just transition? While we've seen the very positive and inverted commas and environmental impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic, such as a 17% reduction in global emissions, huge reductions in air pollution in some of the worst hit cities, but globally, we're seeing some real consequences for people that are not limited to the deeply saddening impacts of those who've lost family and friends. We all know that this is a worrying picture. For those who are sat at home having lost their job, they are not going to be marvelling at the big drop in emissions we've seen, and they certainly wouldn't equate it to a just transition. So, where we are now really highlights the importance of ensuring prosperity for people. It's a key component of meeting our ever more important emissions reductions. Now more than ever, policymakers have to make decisions that ensure people's livelihoods are sustainable while putting us on a path to net zero. And this is where a large number of lobby groups and environmental advocates have recently been calling for a green recovery in response to the economic crisis caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. And while this is credible, we think a slightly different approach is needed. We think that there's a need to highlight to policymakers that net zero actions can compete with other actions that might be put forward in any stimulus package. And I think in this regard, it's useful to consider any net zero action in terms of two stages. First, before emissions reductions can actually begin, there's a need to invest in, to install and to facilitate operation of new equipment, infrastructure and/or systems capability to enable emissions reduction. And this type of activity is pretty standard stimulus package stuff. But second, with the capacity and capability in place, we can actually realise emissions reductions by working with this new capacity in how we live and work. And one issue is that this is likely to affect how much we can do with a given set of resources. That is, we could make efficiency gains, thereby realising and growing real incomes and spending power. Our energy efficiency work and the EVs work that I've discussed today illustrates this point. And we also need to service the new way we do things, which means new and evolving sectors in our economy. For example, do you think we're going to see the emergence of a new marine energy sector that not only supplies renewable energy, but sequesters CO2 generated on shore and which needs transported to storage sites? New activities and evolving sectors in the economy to perform all these component activities mean new potential sources of value generation. But we believe that underpinning all of these considerations, and well, our considerations in this regard as well, is the need to give attention to these 5 generic points of the messages that we've identified, in which we hope will provide a useful context, both for the discussion today and going beyond into the future. So I'll finish now. Thank you all for joining, and I hope you found my own talk interesting, but I'm going to hand over to Jamie now and let him facilitate an open discussion where some more of the CEP team members might join in. Thank you.
Well, that's excellent. Thanks, Karen. I'm afraid one limitation of a webinar is that we can't give you a round of applause. So I'm afraid you'll have to make do without